You usually think of imagination as fiction, a mental invention, separate from what is real. It belongs, you believe, to the world of dreams, not to truth. Yet Ibn Arabi challenged this assumption. He said that imagination is not the opposite of reality, but its bridge, the meeting point where meaning takes form, between intellect and sense. He spoke of a middle world, the imaginal realm, where truth descends into shape and matter ascends into meaning. If imagination reveals rather than deceives, then every image that appears in thought carries a trace of the real. What you call illusion may simply be a truth, not yet recognized. But if imagination is the key to knowing, how can one learn to see through it without being lost within it? Ibn Arabi was born in 12th century Andalusia, a place where philosophy, theology, and mysticism met in constant debate. Thinkers argued whether truth could be reached by pure reason or only through divine unveiling. Ibn Arabi entered this discussion with a third view. Knowledge, he said, is not confined to intellect or sense. It unfolds through imagination, a faculty that perceives meanings beyond both. In his works, such as the Meccan Revelations, imagination was not treated as fantasy, but as the instrument through which divine knowledge becomes visible to the human mind. You have been taught that imagination produces what is not real. To imagine, you think, is to make something up. Yet Ibn Arabi reversed this belief. For him, imagination does not create unreality. It translates existence into forms the mind can perceive. Every act of imagination is an encounter between meaning and perception. The form that arises is not arbitrary. It is a sign of what already exists in a subtler dimension. You begin to wonder, if imagination expresses being rather than inventing it, then illusion is not imagination itself, but its misuse. Perhaps imagination is not the escape from truth, but the very path by which truth reveals itself to awareness. Ibn Arabi called the intermediate realm between matter and spirit Alam al-Khayal, the imaginary world. It is neither material nor purely abstract. It stands between visibility and meaning, the meeting place of the divine and the human. Every symbol, dream, or inspired perception belongs to this realm. He taught that divine meanings descend into this imaginary world before appearing in concrete form, and that every material thing returns through it toward meaning. You begin to see that imagination is not simply a mental act, but a mode of existence. It connects the two levels of reality that ordinary perception keeps apart. If such a world truly mediates between spirit and matter, what faculty allows one to perceive it with precision? For Ibn Arabi, imagination is a sacred practice, not a spontaneous impulse. It must be disciplined, purified, and guided by awareness. The untrained mind uses imagination to project its desires and fears, distorting what it sees. The trained mind uses it to witness truth as it unfolds. He compared the purified imagination to a transparent field where meanings appear without interference. Through inner discipline, desire becomes quiet, and imagination no longer fabricates, it reflects. To imagine rightly is to perceive without adding or removing. Knowledge through imagination requires ethical clarity. How can one claim to see the truth if what one sees is colored by self-interest? Ibn Arabi extended this idea further. The prophets, he said, are those whose imaginations are perfectly aligned with divine command. Revelation does not bypass imagination. It passes through it. The prophet receives meanings from the unseen and expresses them in symbols, laws, and language accessible to others. What appears to ordinary people as a vision or dream becomes, for the prophet, a direct form of knowledge. The distinction lies not in the source, but in the purity of perception. Thus, imagination is not inferior to revelation. It is its vessel. You realize that imagination is not a personal faculty alone. It is a channel of communication between human awareness and divine intention. You rely on the eyes of the body to know what surrounds you. Yet Ibn Arabi said that the real eye of perception is inward, the eye of imagination. It perceives meanings where the senses perceive forms. Through it, the unseen becomes intelligible without losing its mystery. When you imagine, you are not producing a copy of the world, but engaging in its hidden dimension. Every image you hold is a translation of being into awareness. The act of seeing, then, is always twofold: external recognition and inner interpretation. If your inner eye remains closed, how can you claim to know the full reality of what you see? In Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, imagination participates in divine creativity. Existence itself, he said, unfolds through the divine act of imagining. God contemplates himself in infinite forms, and those forms constitute creation. Human imagination, therefore, is not independent. It echoes this cosmic act. When you imagine, you reflect the same principle that sustains the universe. The turning of meaning into appearance. To imagine rightly is to join in divine creativity without claiming ownership of it. To imagine wrongly is to separate the image from its source and make it personal. In that distinction lies the boundary between revelation and illusion. When imagination recognizes its origin, it no longer creates alone. It participates in the act of being. Imagination, for Ibn Arabi, reconciles what appears divided. Through it, spirit takes on form, and form reveals its spirit. The human being stands at this threshold, both observer and participant, both seen and seeing. To awaken imagination is to perceive that every form is meaning made visible, and every meaning is form waiting to appear. When you look at the world in this way, opposites lose their hostility. The material and the spiritual, the visible and the hidden, become two sides of one act of perception. The question is no longer how to move between worlds, but how to dwell where they already meet. You begin to see that imagination is not opposed to truth. It is truth perceived through relation. Every image, thought, or insight is a sign of reality disclosing itself through your awareness. The task is not to transcend imagination, but to purify it until it reflects what it mirrors. When imagination becomes clear, the distinction between inner and outer loses meaning. Reality shows itself not as an object before you, but as a process within knowing itself. The world no longer appears fragmented. Knowledge becomes presence, not something gained, but something recognized. Understanding replaces seeking. At this point, the question that began your reflection has dissolved. You no longer ask whether imagination is illusion or revelation. You see that it is both illusion when governed by the ego, revelation when aligned with the real. For Ibn Arabi, imagination is not a human error, but the divine method of communication. It is how reality becomes intelligible, how the unseen enters awareness. To imagine rightly is to stand at the center of this exchange, to think as existence thinks through you. When imagination returns to its source, the division between heaven and earth disappears. What remains is meaning, pure, unbroken, and self-aware. The reflection begins with doubt. Imagination seems unreal, a play of the mind. Gradually, through Ibn Arabi's teaching, that doubt becomes inquiry. then recognition. Imagination is revealed as the meeting ground of truth and perception, not deception but disclosure. It refines the intellect, completes perception, and unites the human and divine. The journey moves from skepticism to participation, from questioning imagination to realizing it as the very process of knowing. The final stillness is not the end of thought, but the point where thought understands its own source, where imagination, purified of illusion, opens the heavens within awareness itself.